It was late in London, the kind of late where the city feels hollowed out. Offices were dark, streets were damp. Inside a quiet room, Paul McCartney sat hunched over a table that didn't look important enough for what was about to happen. His shoulders were tight, his fingers shook just enough to notice. The light above him buzzed, flickering faintly, as if even it was unsure it wanted to witness this. Ash overflowed from a nearby tray. Ink bled through thin legal paper. Somewhere in the background, a clock ticked far louder than it should have. On the surface, this moment looked impossible. Paul McCartney was 1/4 of the Beatles, the most successful musical act in history. Stadiums, screaming fans, records sold by the millions. But none of that mattered here, because this wasn't about music. It was about control and survival. The papers in front of him weren't a breakup announcement. They weren't a press release. They were legal documents prepared for a move no one thought he'd ever make. Paul was about to sue the very institution that had made him a legend. To the outside world, it would look like betrayal, like ego, like greed. Headlines would frame it as one man tearing down the greatest band ever created. But inside that room, the story felt very different. For months, Paul had been watching something decay in slow motion. Meetings that went nowhere, decisions made without him, money disappearing in ways that didn't add up. He wasn't panicking. Not yet. But the feeling was there, crawling under the surface. The sense that the machine around them had grown too big, too loose, too dangerous to trust. Some would later claim Paul was paranoid, that he imagined threats where there were none. Others whispered darker theories, that unseen forces were pulling strings, that contracts were traps, that the band was being quietly drained from the inside. Those claims sound dramatic, almost eerie. But the grounded explanation is simpler and colder. Legally, Paul was outvoted 3-1 on decisions that governed their entire empire. And once those votes were cast, he had no power left inside the system. That night wasn't emotional in the way people expect. No shouting, no dramatic exit, just the weight of knowing that once the pen touched the paper, there was no way back. He understood exactly how this would look. He also understood that doing nothing might cost him everything he'd built. This wasn't a fight between friends. It was a man standing alone against a structure that no longer protected him. And as he reached for the pen, one truth settled in quietly. This move would either destroy his legacy or save it. So here's the question that still divides people today. Was Paul McCartney the villain who broke up the Beatles, or the only one willing to stop the collapse before it swallowed them all? Apple Corps was supposed to be freedom. That was the promise. A company built by the Beatles where creativity came first and rules came last. No stiff executives, no old-school accountants telling artists what they could or couldn't do, just ideas, talent, and trust. In theory, it was revolutionary. In reality, it became something far more unsettling. From the moment Apple opened its doors, money began bleeding out in strange ways. Friends were hired without qualifications. Passion projects were funded with no oversight. Expenses piled up with no clear accounting. At first, no one panicked. The band was rich beyond imagination. Losses felt abstract, almost fictional. But over time, the numbers stopped being funny. They started to look dangerous. This is where rumors tend to creep in. Some say Apple Corps was cursed from the start. Others claim it was deliberately sabotaged. There are even whispers that chaos was encouraged so someone else could step in and fix it. Those ideas sound dramatic, almost paranormal in tone. But the grounded explanation is brutally simple. Apple was run on optimism instead of structure. And optimism doesn't balance books. Paul saw it earlier than the others, not because he was smarter, but because he was paying attention. Meetings ended without conclusions. Financial reports raised more questions than answers. Decisions affecting millions were made casually, sometimes impulsively. To Paul, it felt like standing on a ship that was still floating, but clearly taking on water. That's when Alan Klein entered the picture. To some, Klein looked like a lifeline. He was aggressive, confident, a man who claimed he could stop the bleeding and make everyone richer overnight. The others were tired, distracted, and ready to believe him. Paul wasn't. Klein's reputation followed him like a shadow. Artists he'd managed before often walked away wealthier, but bitter. Lawsuits trailed behind him. Control always seemed to concentrate in his hands. Here's where interpretations split. One version says Paul was being difficult, clinging to control, unable to accept help. Another version suggests he recognized a familiar pattern. Chaos creates dependency, and dependency hands power to whoever promises order. Both readings exist, and neither fully erases the other. What mattered legally was this. Apple Corps was no longer a creative playground. It was a financial entity spiraling toward loss, and Klein, once hired, held enormous authority over it. Paul's objections didn't stop the vote. He lost 3-1. And with that, the company meant to protect them became something he feared. Because once Apple stopped being theirs in practice, it stopped being safe. And that raised a darker question Paul couldn't ignore. If the company was already out of control, who was it really working for now? By the time Alan Klein had fully embedded himself into the Beatles' world, the atmosphere had changed. Conversations felt heavier. Decisions moved faster, but somehow with less clarity. Klein didn't act like a background administrator. He spoke with certainty. He framed problems as urgent and solutions as time-sensitive. And most importantly, he positioned himself as the only person who truly understood what was happening. To some, that confidence was reassuring. The band had spent years being protected by momentum. Now the momentum was fading, and Klein promised control. Higher profits, cleaner deals, enemies pushed aside. It sounded like rescue. But to Paul, it sounded like concentration of power. Too much of it, too quickly. This is where the story often slips into something darker. Fans still argue that Klein manipulated the group, that he turned them against each other. That subtle pressure and selective information kept Paul isolated. Those claims feel eerie, almost conspiratorial. But there's a grounded explanation that's harder to ignore. Klein's contracts legally shifted authority away from the band as individuals and toward the management structure. Once signed, his influence wasn't emotional, it was contractual. Paul wasn't just uncomfortable, he was trapped. The system now allowed decisions to be made without his consent. Business strategy, financial access, legal positioning. All of it could move forward even if he objected. And he often did. But objections don't matter when the paperwork says otherwise. What made this worse was perception. The others saw Klein as a shield, someone willing to fight on their behalf. Paul saw him as a filter. Information passed through Klein before it reached the band, shaping how problems were understood and who was blamed. Whether that was intentional or simply a byproduct of centralized management is still debated. The result, however, was unmistakable. Paul's isolation deepened. Some later suggested Paul was driven by fear, that he imagined threats because he couldn't control outcomes anymore. That's one interpretation. Another is that he understood exactly how power works when money, contracts, and exhausted artists collide. You don't need secret meetings or whispered plots. You just need signatures, And once those signatures were in place, the rules changed. Quietly, permanently. Because when authority shifts on paper, it doesn't announce itself. It waits. And by the time you feel it, the leverage is already gone. Paul realized something unsettling. If this continued, the band wouldn't just lose control of Apple Corps, they'd lose control of themselves. And that raised a question that wouldn't leave him alone. If the danger wasn't emotional but legal, how do you fight something you already signed away? What finally cornered Paul wasn't an argument. It wasn't a fight in a studio or a slammed door. It was a rule. Quiet, clean, and devastating. Inside the legal structure governing the Beatles, decisions weren't made by consensus. They were made by majority. 4 partners, 1 vote each, and Paul kept losing 3-1. On paper, it sounded fair. Equal voices, equal power. In reality, it meant Paul could be overruled on decisions that affected his finances, his work, and his future. Managerial authority, control of Apple Corps, legal direction. Once the votes were cast, his objections became footnotes. He wasn't being ignored emotionally, he was being erased procedurally. This is where the narrative gets uncomfortable. Some fans frame Paul as stubborn, unable to accept democracy. That interpretation assumes all votes are equal in consequence. They aren't. When 3 people agree to hand control to an external manager, and one person believes that decision is dangerous, the minority doesn't just lose an argument, they lose protection. There's a darker version of this story that still circulates, that Paul was frozen out intentionally, that alliances formed behind closed doors, that conversations happened without him present. Those claims drift toward the eerie, toward paranoia. But again, the grounded explanation doesn't require secrecy. It requires fatigue. The others were exhausted, distracted, burned out by years of pressure. Klein promised relief. Paul promised caution. Relief won. What made this unbearable wasn't just the losses. It was the pattern. Each vote pushed authority further away from the individuals who created the music. Each decision tightened a structure Paul couldn't exit without detonating everything. He began to realize that staying silent wasn't neutral, it was consent, and silence had consequences. Paul tried reasoning. He warned them. He pushed back in meetings that went nowhere. None of it mattered once the legal math was settled. 3 voices outweighed 1, even if that one voice was screaming that something was wrong. Over time, the message became clear. His role had shifted, from partner to obstacle. Some say this was the moment Paul became obsessed with control. Another reading is harsher. He understood that if the system collapsed, the law would not care about intentions, friendships, or legacy. It would only care about contracts, and under those contracts, Paul was exposed. The fear wasn't abstract anymore. It was measurable. If Apple went under, if Klein's management turned toxic, Paul could be dragged down with no escape clause. Winning later wouldn't undo the damage. That's when a realization set in, cold and precise. If the rules of the game guaranteed his loss, then the only move left was to change the game entirely. When the lawsuit became public, it landed like a betrayal written in ink. Headlines didn't bother with nuance. One name stood out, isolated and sharp: Paul McCartney. To fans, it sounded unthinkable. To the press, irresistible. Paul was suing the Beatles. The story framed itself. Greed, control, ego. The easiest explanation won, but the truth was narrower and colder. Paul wasn't suing his bandmates as musicians. He was suing the legal structure that bound them together. Apple Corps, the management framework, the machinery that now made decisions without him. The lawsuit was a surgical move, not a tantrum. It asked the court to dissolve the partnership so each member could protect themselves individually. That distinction vanished in public. Fans needed a villain, and Paul fit the role perfectly. He was visible, vocal, still productive. The others stayed quieter, which read like dignity. Paul's warnings sounded like bitterness. Context collapsed under outrage. Rumors exploded. Some claimed Paul planned this for years. Others said he wanted to dominate the catalog. There were whispers that he was trying to erase the band to crown himself the sole genius. Those ideas feel dramatic, almost sinister. The grounded explanation is simpler. Under the existing contracts, Paul had no veto power and no safe exit. The lawsuit was the only legal door left open. Inside the band, the reaction was brutal. Lawsuits aren't abstract. They feel personal even when they aren't meant to be. Trust evaporated. Conversations froze. Any chance of quiet repair disappeared the moment lawyers entered the room. From that point on, everything said could be used against someone. Paul understood the cost. He knew this would harden resentment. He knew history would flatten the story into a headline. But doing nothing meant staying bound to decisions he believed were actively harmful. In legal terms, inaction would be consent. The timing made it worse. The world still believed the band might survive. The lawsuit shattered that illusion. Even if the music had already stopped emotionally, the legal filing made the ending official. And yet, buried inside the outrage was a truth few noticed at the time. Paul wasn't trying to take something. He was trying to stop being dragged by it. Because once a system turns against you, loyalty becomes a liability. And the question that followed him everywhere was this: did Paul pull the trigger that ended the Beatles? Or did he finally say out loud what had already become inevitable? Once the case reached the courtroom, the noise fell away. No fans, no mythology, no screaming headlines, just contracts, balance sheets, and testimony laid out under fluorescent light. This was the part of the story most people never hear, because it isn't dramatic in the way breakups usually are. It's colder and far more revealing. Paul's argument wasn't emotional, it was structural. He told the court that the partnership governing the Beatles had become unworkable, that decisions affecting millions were being made against his will, that the management arrangement, once locked in, left him exposed to financial risk with no meaningful control. In simple terms, he argued that the system no longer protected its members equally. The defense tried to paint a different picture, that disagreements were normal, that Paul was exaggerating danger, that this was a business dispute inflated by ego. On the surface, it sounded reasonable. Bands fight, partnerships strain. But the court wasn't interested in vibes or intentions. It cared about facts. And the facts were uncomfortable. Financial records showed Apple Corps hemorrhaging money. Governance documents confirmed that Paul could be consistently outvoted. Management contracts placed extraordinary authority in the hands of a third party. The judge didn't need to speculate about motives. The structure itself was enough. This is where a myth still lingers. Some fans believe the court sided with Paul because it favored him personally or because the judge bought into his narrative. That interpretation feels almost mystical, like fate stepping in. The grounded explanation is far simpler. Legally, Paul was right. The partnership was broken in a way that could not be repaired internally. The ruling granted Paul what he asked for. A receiver would be appointed. The partnership would be dissolved under court supervision. Control would be separated so no single manager or majority vote could drag all four members down together. It was a win, quiet, technical, absolute, but it didn't feel like one. Winning meant confirming what Paul had feared all along, that the band, as a legal entity, was no longer safe. that the damage wasn't imagined, that he hadn't overreacted. The court validated his concerns, but it also sealed the end of any illusion that this could have been fixed privately. Outside the courtroom, the verdict barely shifted public opinion. Paul was still blamed, still framed as the man who made it official. The nuance didn't survive translation, and that's the cruel irony of the case. Paul didn't win by proving everyone else wrong. He won by proving the system itself had failed, which left him facing a truth far heavier than losing a lawsuit ever could. Sometimes being legally right means being emotionally alone. The court ruling ended the partnership on paper. Emotionally, it did something far worse. It froze everything in place. After the lawsuit, communication inside the Beatles didn't explode into open war. It thinned out. Messages became formal. Conversations shortened. Silence took over where collaboration once lived. This wasn't a dramatic fallout. It was a slow, permanent distancing, and that made it harder to undo. To the others, the lawsuit felt like public humiliation. Even if Paul's argument was legally precise, lawsuits don't feel precise when your name is on the front page. They feel personal. It didn't matter that he framed it as protection. The act itself rewrote trust. Once lawyers spoke for them, the idea of repairing things privately was gone. Resentment didn't always show up loudly. Sometimes it appeared as dismissal, as jokes at Paul's expense, as interviews where his name was mentioned last, or not at all. The narrative hardened. Paul was the one who couldn't let go, the one who forced the ending. That version spread easily because it was simple. Years later, cracks appeared in that story. John Lennon, in quieter moments, admitted that the band had already fallen apart before the lawsuit, that the legal fight didn't cause the breakup, it just made it official. Those admissions matter, but they came too late to repair damage already done. Some fans still lean into a darker reading. That Paul enjoyed being right, that winning validated something selfish, that he chose security over brotherhood. That interpretation feels satisfying if you need a villain. The grounded explanation is less cinematic. Once the lawsuit happened, forgiveness became impossible, because forgiveness would mean admitting Paul was right all along. And that's a difficult thing to swallow. Paul carried that weight for decades. He kept working, writing, performing. But the shadow followed him. Even success didn't erase the idea that he'd crossed a line no one else would. Being proven correct in court didn't translate into being understood by the people who mattered most. What makes this tragic isn't the anger. It's the absence of resolution, no final conversation, no real closure, just distance that calcified into history. Because in the end, Paul didn't just lose a band. He lost the chance to be forgiven by the people he tried to protect. And that leaves one uncomfortable question hanging in the air. If the truth only comes out years later, does it still count as justice? Time has a strange way of softening outrage. The anger that once felt permanent begins to crack, not because people change their minds, but because evidence piles up. Decades after the lawsuit, the story around Paul McCartney began to shift, quietly, almost reluctantly. Industry experts started revisiting the paperwork. Biographers dug into financial records that weren't public at the time. Legal scholars pointed out something uncomfortable. If Paul hadn't acted when he did, the fallout could have been far worse. Apple Corps wasn't just mismanaged. It was structurally vulnerable, and the contracts tied all four members together in a way that made collective failure possible. This is where the myth begins to dissolve. The idea that Paul killed the band doesn't hold up when placed next to the timeline. The music had already slowed, trust had already fractured, creative paths had already split. The lawsuit didn't cause the collapse. It documented it. There's an eerie belief some fans still cling to, that if Paul had stayed quiet, the band might have healed. That silence could have saved them. It sounds hopeful, almost spiritual, but the grounded explanation is colder. Silence would have locked Paul into decisions he couldn't undo. It wouldn't have restored unity. It would have delayed consequences. What's striking is how many people now admit, often offhandedly, that Paul was probably right. Not heroic, not perfect, just right. That shift matters because it reframes the entire story, not as betrayal, but as intervention, not as ego, but as boundary setting. Even the language has changed. Where Paul was once described as controlling, he's now described as cautious. Where he was called selfish, he's now called pragmatic. These aren't compliments, they're corrections. Still, revision doesn't bring peace. History doesn't apologize. Paul doesn't get back the years of being misunderstood. The others don't get to redo their reactions. Everyone moves forward, carrying a version of the story that no longer fully fits. And that may be the most unsettling part. Truth didn't explode into the open. It seeped in slowly after the damage was done, which leads to a final tension that refuses to resolve. If history proves you right long after the cost is paid, was it worth being right at all? When people argue about this story today, they aren't really arguing about contracts or court rulings. They're arguing about responsibility, about whether loyalty should ever outweigh self-preservation, about whether silence is noble or just fear dressed up as patience. By the time the dust settled, the facts were clear enough. The system governing the band was broken. The money was leaking. Authority had shifted away from the people who created the work. The court didn't speculate. It didn't dramatize. It confirmed what the paperwork already showed. The partnership couldn't continue without putting at least one member at serious risk. And yet, the emotional verdict never aligned with the legal one. To many fans, Paul's decision still feels wrong on a gut level. Not because it lacked justification, but because it violated an unwritten rule. Bands aren't supposed to end in courtrooms. Legends aren't supposed to file paperwork against themselves. There's a romance to collapse that doesn't survive legal precision. Others see something colder and harder to accept. That the band didn't fall apart because one man acted, but because three men chose comfort over caution. That the lawsuit wasn't an explosion, but an evacuation. That Paul didn't destroy something alive. He walked away from something already unstable before it crushed him too. Both interpretations exist because both feel true, depending on where you stand. If you value unity above all else, Paul crossed an unforgivable line. If you value agency and protection, he waited longer than he should have. What makes this story linger isn't the ending. It's the absence of a clean moral. No one walks away innocent. No one walks away purely guilty. Just four people caught inside a system that outgrew the friendships holding it together. And maybe that's why this debate never settles. Because it forces a choice you can't dodge. So decide for yourself. Was Paul McCartney the man who broke the greatest band in history? Or the only one willing to admit it was already broken and act before it was too late?